Hey everyone, I'm Bodie Franklin. Today I'm here to talk to you about a time series analysis I did on Anton Zhang. So this is a data set collected at a train station, which is a huge tourist pass through. It was collected roughly for 4 years as 15 attributes, but we're just going to focus on NO2 levels as that determines the air quality. So before I did any time series analysis, I wanted to get an idea of how unhealthy the air was over the 4 year period. So anything under 50 is defined as good for NO2 levels. 50 to 100 is moderate, and then anything over 100 is unhealthy. So looking at the unhealthy chart, we see this comes out to roughly 4,800, which translates to 6 months. So over that 4 year period, 6 months, the air was unhealthy, which is significant because tourists aren't going to want to travel to a location with poor air quality. So the next step in the analysis is to check the data for the three assumptions of stationarity. Looking at the realizations, we see somewhat wandering behavior, we see damping autocorrelations, we see the special density has a peak of 0, which indicates wandering behavior. So just based off these visuals, I don't think this data set meets the assumptions of stationarity. So the first model I wanted to do was an ARMA model. Again, the data is non-stationary, but I'm fitting a stationary model to it. So through the model building process, I arrived at an ARMA 2.1. So the short-term forecasting I did was 24 hours. So for the ARMA short-term forecasting, the ASE came out to be 1,046. The rolling window is 1,306. Now zooming in on the short-term forecasting, we see how big the spread is. So that makes sense why the ASE is so large at 1,046. The long-term forecasting didn't do much better, so I forecasted out at 720 hours, which is roughly 1 month. That ASE came out to be 1,855 with a rolling ASE of 2235. So zooming in, we see how wide the spread is, so that makes sense why the ASE is so large at 1,855. The next step I did is I wanted to difference the data. So I differenced the data in hopes that it would better be able to model. So at my ARIMA, I came to ARIMA 4.1. And then for the short-term forecasting, this did much better at a 304 ASC with a rolling window of 247. So zooming in on the short-term forecasting, we see how tighter the spread is. So that makes sense why it comes out to 304. And then for the long-term forecasting, again, which is 720 hours, much better at 224. And the rolling ASE came out to be 203. So zooming in on the long-term forecasting, we see how tight the spread is. So that makes sense. It comes out to 224. So for the third model, I did a RUMA. I differenced the data by removing the seasonality from it. And we go from damping autocorrelations to pseudo-soy autocorrelations and a much tighter realization. It's less wandering. And then through the model building process, I came out to a RUMA 6.5. But then the short-term forecasting didn't seem to much better. It came out to be 3581 with a rolling window of 2305. Then looking at the long-term forecasting, this came out to be 2410, and then a rolling ASE of 2468. So despite moving the seasonality from it, the forecasting didn't improve at all relative to the other two models. So the fourth model I did was a signal plus noise. So verifying this through the ARCA method, I short-term forecast with the signal plus noise, and it came out with an ASE of 2650. But then looking at the visualization, we see how wide the spread is. So again, that makes sense why this is so large. And then unfortunately, the long-term forecasting didn't do much better. It came out to be 1871. So for the fourth model I did was a VAR model. I used temperature as the explanatory variable. But looking at the realizations, it was very clear to me that I had to difference the data. So after I difference the data, you have much tighter realizations. You have pseudo-soy autocorrelations versus the damping autocorrelations. But despite using a VAR model with an explanatory variable, the ASE didn't come out much better at all. It came out worse actually at 4,090, which again makes sense given how big the spread is between the forecast and the realizations. Then looking at the long-term forecasting, this came out to be 4315, but what's interesting about this graph is that it shows that it's almost like mirror images. So the forecast is mirroring the realizations. So perhaps NO2 and temperature have inverse relationships, so it might have been better to use a different explanatory variable for the VAR model. For my fifth model, I did a neural network, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to utilize all 31,000 records within the data set for this model. Due to computing limitations, I had to only use 5,000 records. And as a result of that, the ASE came out to be 3731. And given the visualization, it makes sense why the ASE is so large. And then the long-term ASE didn't fare much better. It came out to 1806. But what's interesting about the neural network is I'm only using 5,000 records, and it has comparable metrics against the VAR model, which is using complete records. So this makes me think that if I had the computing power to use an entire record, that the ASEs would have been much better for the neural network. Then my final model I did is an assembled model of the ARMA and the signal. So what I did is I averaged both the long-term and short-term forecasting respectively, and it came out with an ASE of 2821. And if I take the average of the ARMA and the signal short-term ASE, it comes out to about 2821, which makes sense again, since I'm just averaging the two. Then looking at the long term, again, this came out 2770, which is roughly the average of long-term forecasting for the ARMA and the signal model. So this didn't fare much better at all, actually. So looking at the model performances, the REMA did the best at a short-term ASE of 304, long-term is 224, and then the rolling windows were 247, 203. Everything else was roughly in the thousands. So what this indicates to me is that the ARIMA significantly outperformed all these models, but what seems to be a trend in the data set is that on all the long-term ASEs, the models did so much better in respect to the short-term ASEs. So what I think this suggests is that the data set is more geared towards long-term forecasting instead of short-term forecasting. Well, that concludes my analysis. Please let me know what you think in the comment section below, and thank you so much for watching.